Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this eighth and final topic in the Great Decisions Masterclass. Today, our attention turns to climate migration. As we look at the global system, there are several regions of the world that we consider to be pressure points for the migration of people for a variety of reasons. In our hemisphere, people traditionally move to the north into the United States and Canada, from Africa and the Middle East especially into Western Europe, and those people in Southeast Asia who feel the need to move oftentimes go to Australia or New Zealand. The response of Western nations to migration has varied along this spectrum from soft line, represented by a desire to accept all migrants, to a more hardline position where migrants in general are rejected. Neither of these extremes is tenable. We cannot simply allow migrants to enter our country unfettered. At the same time, the humanitarian impulse and the needs of our country long term tell us that at least some migrants must be accepted. What we're left with is the very difficult policy process of managing the flow of humans as they cross international boundaries. Managing migration happens in stages. If people from country A are moving to country B, there are three basic places where flows of migrants can be managed. The first is in the sending state itself. If the situation there is dire, a lack of economic opportunity, a brutally repressive regime, or general insecurity, investments can be made in country A to lighten or alleviate the number of people who might decide to leave. The next opportunity to manage migration is on their way to their desired country. We can have people move to third parties, providing countries with support necessary so that they may house on a permanent or temporary basis those who have decided to leave country A. And finally, we can focus on policies here at home. Once a migrant reaches our borders, how do we treat them, handle, and process them? On what basis do we accept them, and on what basis do we reject them from entry into the country? Migration falls into broad categories, voluntary and involuntary. Someone who leaves their country voluntarily is probably doing so to find a better job, to join family members abroad, and to enjoy the freedoms allowed in that targeted country. Involuntary migrants are looking for any job because there is not one back home, and they're oftentimes bringing their family with them, flying to safety, as opposed to the devastating situation in their country of origin. Oftentimes they're escaping danger. The challenge of climate migration is that it crosses this broad boundary. Both voluntary and involuntary migrants are oftentimes leaving home because of climate change in their country of origin. Let's look at ways to differentiate migrants. As you see here, there are a number of people seeking safe refuge or better opportunity abroad. We could apply one standard. What is in our best interest? Of these migrants, which have the job skills, the language skills, or any other determination that we apply that makes it in our interest to accept them. In so doing, we identify a subset of the larger migrant pool to allow into the country. On the other hand, we could ask what is best for the migrants themselves. What do they need to find safety and security? And in so doing, we identify a different subset of the migrant population. It may be that some migrants, two in this example, qualify both for what is best for us and is best for them. So where do we draw the lines? Do we allow this group into the United States? Do we focus instead on that group? Or do we limit ourselves only to those migrants who need to enter the U.S. and reflect our best policy priorities? What is politically possible is an intervening variable, because politics is deeply divided over how to handle migration policy. About a decade ago, the so-called Gang of Eight, these are senators from both the Republican and the Democrat Party that formed a small coalition to develop a policy on migration they believed was acceptable by both political parties. In 2023, the Gang of Eight is dead. There is no middle ground. You either accept migrants or take up a position of rejecting them all. It was Ronald Reagan in the 1980s who said, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though some time back they may have entered the country illegally." That was a soft line approach to migration that enjoyed bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, even though it opened up the floodgates for migration moving forward. While it was billed as a policy of one-time application, amnesty sent the signal to people far and wide that if they arrive in the U.S., even illegally, put down roots and stay out of trouble, they will be awarded a green card and a path to U.S. citizenship. When NAFTA was signed in 1994, merging the economies of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, there was broad bipartisan agreement on migration. Both Democrats and Republicans agreed at the same level as to whether migration strengthened the country. The divide between the two political parties began around 2006 and has broadened dramatically since. NAFTA, a driver in this debate, largely resulted in a wedge between the political parties to the extent that America in 2016 was ready for a populist candidate who promoted building a wall to keep out Mexican migration. When we ask people today what really matters to them heading into the next election, climate change and migration, today's topics, rank 4th and 5th respectively. It is only when we combine them into climate migration that they climb the ladder to the point of being equal to the global pandemic. Today, there are three main considerations before we think about U.S. foreign policy. We'll look at and define climate migration, consider the cause and effect of migration, and then finally consider climate change itself. Climate migration happens when natural disasters cause people to leave their homes. 21.5 million people each year migrate because of natural disasters. The vast majority of them are internally displaced, meaning they leave their homes and villages, but they stay in country. The experts estimate that by mid-century, because of global warming, sea level rise, drought, and forest fires, all driven by changes in the climate, that number will climb to some 140 to 1 billion people worldwide, and they will be international refugees, crossing boundaries, entering Europe, Australia, and the United States principally. Climate migration happens in two stages. First of all, people move from their farms, from rural areas, because there's no longer the feasibility of growing food due to climate change. They move into population centers, where they become impacted and feel the need to move abroad. They do that in the second stage of climate migration movement. A dilemma is then faced in the new host country. Do we accept these migrants? Do we send them back across the border? Do we try to fix the situation back home so that they can return to the country of origin? As we look at our area of the world, the southern United States and Mexico, it's pretty clear that levels of extreme or exceptional drought are happening on an annual basis. This drives Mexican farmers to the cities and on to the United States. Worldwide, the projections for the decade of the 2030s are rather dire. Drought is anticipated in much of the areas of Asia, Africa, Latin America that have been driving migration for the past generation. If we look to the law for a solution, we find a gaping hole. Migrants of opportunity are largely covered by domestic laws. Unless someone is forced from their home out of a well-founded fear of persecution, domestic law allows us to reject them. If they are seeking refuge and are asylum seekers, there are international laws that exist that condition our domestic response to refugees in asylum categories. In between the two, we find climate migrants. They are not covered by international or domestic law very effectively. We do have an interesting case study, considered a landmark decision back in 2020, when a man from Kiribati, a sovereign nation in the Pacific, made his way to New Zealand, forced from his land because of climate change. His asylum request was denied by New Zealand. A United Nations Human Rights Court, however, ruled in his favor, making him the first climate refugee in modern world history. Let's now look at cause and effect. Codifying rules to deal with climate migrants is incredibly difficult, because when we see people in a country of origin decide to leave for some reason, our decision on whether to accept or reject them is determined by the reason for their departure. If it was war and violence, they may be asylum seekers. If it's for economic opportunity, those asylum laws don't apply. And for sheer poverty, we're more than likely to say they're not genuine asylum seekers. The problem is that climate migrants are driven out of their country because of poverty, the loss of jobs, and oftentimes climate change leads to war and violence at home. It makes it very difficult to differentiate those who are seeking safety from persecution from those who are simply looking for a better place to live. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has 90% of refugees under its mandate as being from countries on the front line of climate emergency. This sounds like the overwhelming majority of refugees are indeed climate migrants. That, however, is not the case. It's a misleading statistic, because if we look at all of the global undocumented migrants, those under the mandate of the UN High Commission is a very small percentage. Only about 10% of all global migrants are covered by the UNHCR agenda and mandate. Climate change, of course, is a focus of this lecture and this foreign policy great decision. What is certain about climate change is that it's happening. People can debate the causes of climate change, but there's no doubt that the air and the water are getting warmer. The implications of this climate change are borderline overwhelming. The solutions to solving it are complex and multifaceted, requiring cooperation among many nation states. And within those nations, there's a great political divide over what to do about the changing climate. There are three key actors in the United States in dealing with climate change-related issues: the scientists who present their data, the elected officials who must make the laws, and the general public who must support those elected officials. Back in 1987, there was a consensus in the public, among the scientists and elected officials, that chlorofluorocarbons were eating a hole in the ozone, protecting the Earth. As a result, the Montreal Protocol was reached, the United States was a full-fledged supporter, and the ozone was protected moving forward. We simply changed the way that we cooled air for air conditioning purposes, and we banned aerosol sprays. That sort of widespread agreement is essential for successfully addressing climate change challenges. Confronting climate change. Many argue for more actions, while others argue for less action. The problem with the public in the United States is that we are equally divided between and across this spectrum of action. Climate change itself is changing. 40 years ago, we talked about global warming. That language turned to climate change, which is much more digestible for the American public, because oftentimes climate change involves a cooling of the weather, as opposed to simply warming. Climate change is now giving way to what we call extreme weather, something that everyone can see happening around them and that both political parties can rally around to confront. The costs of extreme weather are growing exponentially. Between 2000 and 2021, on average, we spent about $32 billion per year in addressing extreme weather disasters. In 2002 alone, that toll reached $65 billion, doubling the annual average. And that is before we add to it the catastrophic cost of one Hurricane Ian, which struck the southwest area of Florida. That nearly doubled the extreme weather cost in 2022. Only a few weeks ago here in Florida, a minimum level 1 Hurricane Nicole hit the southeastern portion of the country, adding another $500 million in expenses. Environmentalists argue that not only is less action not desirable, but that more action isn't enough. We need to take massive action to address the climate change crisis that the world currently confronts. We saw this graph in the very first lecture on energy geopolitics, where the amount of money the United States would need to spend moving forward is more than triple our traditional spending levels in addressing climate change and hitting our 2030 goal. This is highly problematic financially, even more so when we consider that as we invest increasingly in solar, wind, and water sources of energy, this is a highly inflationary force that raises the cost of investment. We now turn our attention to foreign policy options in addressing climate migration. Not that long ago, our focus was on a slowly changing climate. Now we realize the changes have accumulated to the point that we have to reverse climate change. International accords have addressed this issue in places like Paris, Kyoto, and Rio. But increasingly it appears that we're headed for a hot planet no matter what we do, that we're going to have to respond to a world where certain portions are simply no longer livable and where agriculture is increasingly limited in where it can be grown. The American intelligence community and the Pentagon have reached this point of discussion. Recently, the Pentagon has concluded that climate change poses a risk to our national security. The military has been dragged into the political fray. As governors from Texas and Florida bus migrants in their states to Washington, D.C., the Pentagon has been asked for assistance in helping with that transport and later guarding those migrants upon arrival. The U.S. intelligence community issued its first national intelligence estimate on climate change, focusing on cross-border geopolitical flashpoints. What it is stating is that climate change is causing conflict abroad that is forcing people to cross international boundaries. Our ability as a nation to formulate policy to address climate migration requires agreement across many boundaries, political and international. We need a domestic policy that addresses climate migrants, coordinate that policy with other nations. We cannot look at migration in a vacuum. It originates across international boundaries. Those migrants flow into the United States. For this, we need long-term bipartisan political consensus that's based upon a broad level of U.S. public support and buy-in. When we don't have political bipartisan consensus, which we clearly don't, that undermines any broad base of American support for the policies that are necessary. Bipartisan agreement is necessary. Partisan divide represents a significant obstacle to successful policy formation. We have options at our disposal. We can focus on our own border. We can attempt to divert migrants before they reach the United States, or we can aid those countries, places like Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and Venezuela, that are primary sources of migration in our hemisphere, where people are seeking refuge in the United States. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this 8-lecture master class in U.S. foreign policy. We encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.